Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for inviting me here today to talk to you a little bit about livestock traceability and how that might benefit from some of the lessons learned by others. And we're going to focus a little bit on a couple of different sectors in the food industry this morning, although there are other places that we could go and actually look for some lessons learned. Talk first of all a little bit about some of the myths and facts around traceability, and some of you are probably very familiar with all this because you've been talking about it for a long time. In fact, when I was first invited to speak this morning, I was talking with Katie and with Glenn, and I said, I seem to recall having a similar conversation with NIAA back around 2005. So, you know, I don't want to say anything, but somebody this morning said something about fast-talking Canadians. So I'm going to try and slow down a little bit and help with the lessons learned here and what we might be able to do next. So, some key points I want to leave with you this morning, and that is, first of all, whole chain traceability, and I'll talk about what that means in a little bit, is really a proven tool. And it's not just a proven tool in the food industry and sectors within the food industry, but it's also a proven tool in other industries such as pharmaceuticals and automotive and aerospace and electronics. In fact, if you take out your iPhone or whatever smartphone you happen to be carrying, the individual components of that phone can be traced back to the point of origin. So if we can do that with something that we carry around in our pocket and drop occasionally, you would think that we would be able to do that with our food. Second of all, the key point being that collaboration is obviously key, and Undersecretary Ibach reinforced that point several times during his remarks. And it really is not only a smart thing to do, but it actually ends up enhancing your business performance. And as business people, I'm sure you're going to appreciate that. And the third point is that traceability means you need to change the way you think about the issue. It offers a really, really critical value, and a value that perhaps many livestock producers don't necessarily always think about. A key one is consumer trust. And we'll talk about why that is important as well as we go through here. So traceability has evolved over the last 15 years, as I said, since I perhaps last talked to this group. The first one is that consumers are now driving the bus in the food industry. In fact, a good friend of mine, the dean of the business school at Dalhousie University in Halifax, says that the consumer is now the CEO of the food system. And if you don't believe that, you just have to start to appreciate some of the media reports and obviously social media growth in the last 5 years to understand that consumers are now becoming, to use a pun, consumed with the whole idea of where does my food come from, how is it treated, how is it processed, how is it grown. And it's now started to become mainstream, so that we've got things like tuna actually advertising right on the can that it's traceable. And in fact, this particular brand of tuna, you can take the production number off that, put it into a website, and it'll actually show you where the tuna was caught, what boat it might have been transferred to in order to get processed while at sea, and certainly where it was packaged and put into cartons. Also, and this is where I perhaps diverge a little bit from some of the conversation that's been going on so far, is that traceability is about more than recalls in animal health. Certainly those are important issues. But if that's all the conversation entails, you're going to be missing the opportunity for significant business improvement. So the next obvious question would be, well, how does traceability actually help my business? And we can talk about that in a minute as well. The title on my first slide said that traceability was free. And what do we mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that you're actually able to capture more value from your business with traceability than without it. First of all, it establishes a discipline around the treatment of your animals or the treatment of your food product, if you want to look at it that way, that is very much like other good farming practices or good manufacturing practices. The second one is that it helps you reduce business risk in the event of a recall, but also in the event that you have some other kind of failure within your system. So that is the one that most of us seem to think about. But we also need to think about it actually reduces the costs of poor quality. So this is when something bad has happened, and now you have to do something about it. Traceability actually helps reduce the cost of normalizing your operation. A really key one is that it streamlines your ability to work with your supply chain partners. And so that includes your feed providers. It also includes the feedlots and the processors that are downstream from your operation. And the last one is, and this is the one that we talk about when we talk about the export markets, is that it strengthens brand equity and market access. And so those values actually far outweigh the cost of traceability. It's just that it's oftentimes difficult for people to see those values in really hard dollar terms. And so what you get hung up on is the fact that I have to change the way I'm doing something, and therefore you lose sight of the opportunity that that creates. So what is traceability? And I'm first of all just going to go ahead one slide and talk about this. I kind of categorize traceability into two areas. One is what I call internal traceability, and that's the ability to follow a product within your business. So if you were in a feedlot or if you're a rancher, you've got the opportunity to use traceability identifier tags and all of the records associated with those particular animals to manage your business internally. And this is being done quite commonly in Canada. External traceability refers to that notion of whole chain. In other words, now we're starting to talk about the ability to follow product all the way from the farm to the dinner table. That's a little bit of a different animal, requires a different skill set, but it relies on internal traceability. So now I'm going to go back one slide and talk about, so what is traceability? How do we define that? First of all, traceability is not about the tech. It's not about identifiers and barcodes and RFID tags and readers, and I mean those are all really, really important aspects of traceability. But those are the tools of traceability. When we were at the Global Food Traceability Center, which is a division within the Institute of Food Technologists, we really asked ourselves this question, and we were asking our stakeholders this question. Is what is traceability? And the best definition that we were able to come with was traceability is the systematic ability to access any or all information pertaining to a particular product or food under consideration. And that is throughout the entire life cycle of that product. And it's using recorded identification. So those are some key points that we want to make here. First of all, it relies on information. Second of all, it's systemic. It's across the entire system. You want to be able to do this across an entire food system. And it's throughout the entire life cycle of the product. So all the way from the farm to when it's eaten or disposed of in some way, shape, or form. And for this to happen, a traceability needs to keep track of the information that's associated with either the animal or the food product that's been manufactured from that animal. And it keeps track of when the units are created, used, joined together, split up, or finally disposed of or sold. And I know there's all kinds of other things that might be going on in your mind that happen to your particular animals or to the food products that you buy, but what we found is by and large there's only a few categories of activities that you really need to focus in on in order to have traceability. So that system provides access to all of the information about the food product. That's the first key thing. It's not just those particular aspects of the food that are verifiable by analysis. So we seem to be focused in, as we naturally do in livestock traceability, on the identification of the animal. And we say, if we could just identify where that animal came from. Okay, stop. Where did it come from? Right? So we've got an identifier on an animal, but where did it come from? We have to identify, obviously, the ranch or the feedlot or the processing plant or the sales area that it came from. And so you start to think about traceability as much more than just putting an RFID tag on a steer's ear. Traceability also provides the ability to trace the product forward and backwards. So we're all familiar with that notion, but it's important to state it. It provides access to all of those data properties of a food product or ingredients in all its forms across all links in the chain. So this is a much broader look at what traceability is than just livestock traceability for the purpose of animal disease control. So as you can see, by looking at the broader picture of this, you start to understand the influence that what you're considering can have on not just your specific sector of the industry, but the entire food system. And this is where the Global Food Traceability Center was focusing its efforts, was on the entire food system, because to put a very fine point on it, there are 2 major developed countries in the world that do not have national livestock traceability systems. One of them is India, and you can guess where the other one is. Based on systemic recording and exchange of data, so there is a requirement here now to gather, store, and share information. And that brings up a whole bunch of other issues. That starts to get everybody thinking about, okay, what's the cost of that? How do I have to change my business practices? Who else is going to see this data? And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And then the last point is that there is some requirement for a standard around the information that's going to be used. If every one of the 50 states in the United States decides to pick a different way of numbering its cattle, for an example, you can quickly see how this might become a little bit problematic and actually drive the costs up. And so the notion that NIAA is pursuing, the idea of a national system, albeit maybe composed of state subsystems, is a good one. It is going to simplify that exchange of information if there's a common standard applied across all of the stakeholders. So let's talk a little bit about the myths and facts around this. There's lots of issues. Excellent report came out from the United Nations FAO just a couple of days ago, where it talks about, about a dozen different factors that influence the need for traceability. But the ones that we hear most commonly revolve around the cost. Okay, it's going to cost me money, and it's going to cost me time, and all this kind of thing. Around liability, it's going to expose me. Around data security, who gets to see this? How do I protect my security? Apparently Facebook can't even do that. And then there's the loss of efficiency, which again gets back to the notion that I have to change my practices. So let's talk about these individually. So the first notion, or the first false fact, is that traceability increases my liability, and that is actually untrue. When we've actually shown that in a number of case studies, is that traceability not only reduces your exposure to risk, because you're now managing the way you develop your product differently, or you grow your animal differently, but in the event that something really bad happens, it's a proof point. Hey, I did my due diligence, it's not me. Right? And the faster that you can do that, the more readily you'll be able to get back to business as normal. Traceability means lost privacy and confidentiality, and this is one that I hear a lot of. In fact, I've been working on food traceability now since 2003, and that was the one that came up most often from livestock guys. Not just from beef, but from all the other livestock groups as well. And I even had one rancher say to me one time, he says, well, I don't want PETA, or PETA, however you pronounce it, I don't want them knowing where I am. I said, they already know where you are, right? You're a business. This has nothing to do with your private information. You are a business, and you're in the business of providing food to the marketplace. Understand that people are going to necessarily want to know, where did that food come from? How is it processed? How is it handled? And who sold it to me? So traceability can actually increase the transparency that you show to your consumers, or if you just want to look at the next one down the chain, the customer that you sell it to. It allows you to build trust. And this is an important component of actually improving the performance of your own business. Traceability is a technology problem. That's the issue that a lot of people, and my apologies to Glenn and others who are in the technology business, and I worked for IBM for a number of years, is it really is a business opportunity. It's not about the technology. The technology that you use is going to vary as much as the individual businesses that you each run. But it is an opportunity for you to drive revenue. Traceability should be or must be driven by regulators, and certainly there's a role for regulators and government in this. They can be almost give you the guidance to stay within the lines on the highway and give you some sense of direction and speed, but it really is business value that's going to drive the adoption of traceability. And this is a key point, and it's one that's not often made. And that is, it's important to stop thinking about traceability as the thing. Traceability is just a tool. The thing you want is improved business performance. You want improved response performance. You want more customers. You want more access to markets. Those are the things that you want as a business person or as a regulator. It's not the notion that you have to have this in order to eliminate an animal disease. That's certainly important. But if that's the only reason that you do this, it becomes very difficult to justify. And so you need to stop thinking about traceability as somehow this thing that sits off alone, when it is in fact underlying all of what you do in your business. And then, as I talked about it earlier, traceability is in fact delivering a value that's higher than the cost to you of implementing it. And people say, well, I have to take that on faith. No. There are, in fact, tools available that will show you that the investment in traceability can come back to you many times over. And others have demonstrated this. As I said, the entire smartphone industry could not exist without traceability. So summarizing it up quickly, traceability is a tool that reduces costs and reduces risks. It increases value chain efficiency. It increases the ability to follow a product through, for sure. But what's more important is it allows you to become much more disciplined about how you order your feed, or how you order your supplements, or what you do when you sell to a feedlot, or what they do when they sell it to a processor. And the third point here is that collaboration is key. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more this afternoon on the seafood side of things when we talk about aquaculture, is that we have found is that the more collaboration exists, again facilitated by traceability, the better your business will perform. It seems counterintuitive, I know, but new ideas often are, right? So more collaboration actually improves the performance of your business. So let's talk about specific cases here, and then we'll hopefully be able to move on. I'm just going to touch briefly upon produce and upon seafood. So Produce Traceability Initiative began because of a number of issues, and I'll show you a timeline here in just a moment, but it is a vulnerable sector. The one thing that I hear a lot about in the livestock sector, whether it's goats or whether it's sheep or cattle, is that our business is different. Everybody's business is different. The difference in the produce sector is that it has short shelf life. There's a lot of cold and warm cycling, so it comes from a warm field into a cold, and then goes into a shipping dock, and then it moves into a refrigeration unit. So there's a lot of up and down. So it is a vulnerable product. It's a very complex global trade system. In the United States alone, there are over 180,000 businesses that work just with produce. And it has a really interesting work environment. It goes all the way from low-tech, laborers to very, very high technology food processing plants. And what are the key drivers of change there? Ask yourself, does this sound familiar? Consumer-driven demands for fresh, safe produce. Growing concerns over foodborne illness. Seems every week we hear about something like this. Food fraud, mislabeling. And then there's all of the risks associated with your business that come under pressure as the liability costs and the business risks increase. So this is it's probably hard to read at the back, but the whole point behind this particular chart is to show that back in 2006, right around the time Taco Bell had an E. coli outbreak that killed 4 people, that the produce industry asked its associations writ large to start to consider the idea of having traceability along the entire chain, from the point at which it's picked in the field or in the greenhouse to the point at which it's sold. A lot of things accelerated that process, and the reason I'm making a point of putting this timeline up here is to, first of all, give you the sense that it's never just one particular thing that triggers a change. And the second one is, it's almost always from the outside in. And it becomes very, very costly if you're trying to manage a crisis at the same time as affect a change to your industry. But the big one here was this one. And I don't know if anybody remembers, but around 2008 there was a whole outbreak of Salmonella St. Paul that was created, and initially the FDA thought it was tomatoes. And of course then the tomato industry went in the tank. And then guess what? Oops, our bad. It wasn't that, it was jalapeno peppers. And some of the jalapeno peppers came from Mexico and some of them came from other states. But the whole point is that the lack of a traceability system, or an effective traceability system, because it wasn't they didn't have any, was that an industry just got slammed for an entire year, and it took it, and according to the PMA, the Produce Marketing Association, it took 4 years for the industry to get back to the level of revenue where they had been. So you kind of say, well, yeah, but I'm a small farmer. What has that got to do with me? Well, you're in that industry. You will be affected by that kind of catastrophe. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but the point is that the Food Modernization Act was signed into law right around 2012, and by that point, they were ready to kick off and actually start to implement key elements of the traceability program. And you say, geez, did it take them 6 years to do that? Well, not really, but there was a lot going on. And the reality is that they were making decisions that were led by a group of industry participants. This wasn't the government coming in and saying, thou shalt. The industry took the reins and they actually drove this forward. And this is just, again, an idea, right? So if you were to say, okay, if we were going to do that, how would we do that? And so here's the idea that the produce industry came up with, was to have a Produce Traceability Council. There was an executive committee that kind of oversaw the, whoops, wrong button. Keep going. There we are. So the industry had an executive council. There were commodity interest groups. So in the produce industry, there was a group for strawberries and other berries, and there was a group for leafy greens. And then there was the working groups. There was 5 of them. There was one around talking about the master data that's required for traceability. How are we going to define it? Implementation issues. That's around the physical nature of it. Industry communications, which is key, because we're going to keep people informed about what we're doing, the technology, and the buyers. So these were the 5 working groups that the produce industry came up with. And the key lessons here are the decision by the industry to act together was key. So that's what you guys are debating right now. They had an industry steering team that guided the strategy and the planning. And the decision was made that we were going to take traceability down to the case level. We weren't going to individually identify each box of strawberries, but we are going to identify it at a case level. They agreed on using what are called GS1 identification standards, and GS1 is a e-commerce, not-for-profit international organization that creates standards around identification numbering. And so the decision was made in produce, rather than invent our own, let's use one that already exists. And the program did focus on whole chain. So it was from the field to the point of sale. So I'm going to talk about the seafood industry quite a bit more this afternoon. But there were two projects that I wanted to mention to this group this morning. And one was a project that focused on the impact of implementing traceability. That is, how did it affect business performance? How did it affect consumer perception of seafood? And what was the impact on food waste of having traceability? And then the other one was a decision support tool. And I'm going to point you at this one right now quickly, because what we did was we actually built a tool that allowed an individual seafood, either somebody who actually farms it or catches it or a processor or what have you, to go in and use the tool to actually create their own business economic argument for investing in traceability. So there are tools out there that can help you do this. And it wouldn't take much to take that tool and modify it so that it works for this industry. The other project was very interesting. We looked at about 48 different companies around the world, and we figured out a number of key things. And first of all, we found that the companies that were most successful, whether they were retailers or catchers or aquaculture, these guys actually got more benefit if they looked strategically at traceability rather than tactically. The benefits were greater when they actually collaborated and closely integrated their systems with those that were upstream and downstream. It was important to establish first why you want to do this before going out and starting to buy technology. And the third one was approach it with a big vision. In other words, this notion of whole chain, but take little steps to get there. So when you're talking about an executive steering committee, that might be saying, here is ultimately where we want to go, but now we have to implement, and we're going to take baby steps to get there. Oh, and government. Start enforcing the regulations you got now before you pass additional laws. I'm sorry that our Undersecretary seems to have left and missed that message. Enforce the legislation so that it actually creates what you're trying to create. In other words, if you really want to create more efficient industries, well then do that, right? And pursue consistency and harmonization. What we found in the seafood industry is where there was a lack of consistency in the enforcement of existing regulation, that was where fraudsters would take advantage. So it's very difficult for an individual business to do that, but it's not difficult for government. So government needs to be a partner here, and they need to play a role. So what's next? Get engaged and decide to act. There's a lot of discussion going on, and as Undersecretary Eibach said, I think we need to move beyond the discussion. We actually need to decide to act. Traceability has proven that it's worked. Let's go on beyond that, and let's start to talk about the hows and whos. Collaborate with your partners around the solutions. It's really important. The more you collaborate, the more you will get out of this process. Focus on a dialogue and action. Dialogue's important, but what's even more important is to actually act. And I know that Anne's going to talk a little bit about that in a minute or two here on how to do that. And the last thing, as I said earlier, is that this does involve a change in thinking. Traceability is an innovation tool. It's not the end in itself. It's actually something that can actually be used to make your business perform better. So with that, I'll thank you.